Ooh, it's the Wood Whisper special. Making stuff and making things that we give to people.
Now our advent calendar is meant to look like a tree, and every tree needs some kind of a base. So we're going to build a very simple base out of 1/2-inch Baltic birch, pretty much the scrap material that was left over from all the other cuts. You can use it for this. Let me show you how it goes together. The dimensions for all these parts are in the plan. Just keep in mind the plan calls for nice even numbers. So when I say 1/2 inch, you have to measure your actual 1/2-inch stock because it's probably a little bit undersized. But once you start building this, you'll see how it all goes together and you can make adjustments as needed. So the top is going to get some trim material here on the outside, and it's going to be raised up a little bit. So I need to have a line here for reference so I know exactly how far up this goes. You don't want to put it flush like this. It needs to come up by 3/4 of an inch. So I'm just going to set my adjustable here for 3/4 and draw a reference line on all 4 sides. Okay, and now when I glue this piece in, I'm going to bring it down, flush with the sides, and try to get as close as I can to my pencil line. Now before attaching the advent calendar top to the base, we want to make sure that we sand everything thoroughly. That means sanding away any glue, sanding away any marks or unevenness in the surfaces. It's also a good time to get some of that filler and fill any of those little nail holes that are left behind, or if there's small cracks that would kind of show themselves even through a coat of paint. I mean, the coat of paint is going to be pretty forgiving in the sense that it's going to cover just about everything. But if there are surface flaws or holes, a lot of times the paint isn't going to cover those. So you want to make sure all the surfaces are nice and smooth with no flaws and nicely rounded over. Now our top is going to sit on our base just like this, but that can't be it, right? Every tree needs a trunk. So cut yourself a piece of solid stock, or you could even laminate a couple pieces of ply to get this. But basically it's going to be about 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches and 4 inches long. And you have to size it so it fits perfectly. The 1.5 inch dimension should fit nice and snug between our front and back bottom rails. And you want the height, the 4-inch dimension, to be perfect so that we're making contact at the top and we're making contact at the bottom. So 1.5 by 1.5 by 4 is an approximation. Just make sure you size it perfectly. Now here's the thing. You've got a couple options in how you mount this. One is center mounted and the other is toward the back. Now I prefer mounting it toward the back. Part of the reason is the post can be glued to the inside of the base here, which gives us a lot more support. The problem and what my concern was is if it's mounted toward the back here, I originally thought that it might be, have a tendency to tip backwards with most of the weight focused in that direction. So what I'm going to recommend is if you are placing this in the middle of a room on a table and it's out for display, I might recommend center mounting it. And that way it's completely balanced, it looks even, and symmetrical from both sides. If you're putting it up against a wall, maybe on a shelf, on a ledge or something like that, I would recommend pushing it toward the back. And this way you get a little bit more of a view of the trunk. It looks a little bit more decorative in the front, and you don't really have a concern with it tipping backwards because it's right up against the wall. I will mention that if you do mount it in the center, when this little tree trunk here is in the middle, you want to probably drive a couple of screws up through the bottom and into the trunk to help secure it in place, just to be safe. And then of course use glue where your rails touch the top of the bottom piece. But for me, what I'm going to do is mount it toward the back, and let me show you exactly how it's going to be done. So to get started, I have a couple reference marks here, 1.5 inches in from this inside edge. One there, and one there. And that's just for reference. So I'm going to be able to drop our little post in and use that to line everything up, and we know that we're centered. So all we need to do is add a little bit of glue here. In fact, I'll put this down. I'm just going to take my pencil, put a mark there, and that shows me that my glue shouldn't go past that line. Drop it in place. Now we just add the clamp. There we go. Let that dry for about an hour. So the glue is dry on our post, and I guess at this point, if you really wanted to, you can glue the top down to the base, but I recommend holding off because if you're gonna paint it like I am, you're gonna have this top section a different color than the base. And I'll go into details on that in a minute, but it's gonna be a heck of a lot easier to hit all of these inside areas if there isn't this big thing sitting on top of it. So I'm gonna save the final glue up for after the painting is done. Now, speaking of the painting, I know you guys love it when I throw myself into something that's outside of my comfort zone, and oddly enough, painting is one of those things. I worked in a refinishing shop for about a year and a half before I started my business, and I learned a lot about applying different types of finishes. But the closest thing I got to applying paint was putting pigments into lacquer and sort of making my own specialty colored paints and custom colors. That's about the extent of it. So when I go into the world of like acrylic paints and things, it's just foreign to me. So I'm gonna do the best I can, and I don't know how much I'm gonna teach you in this process because I'm probably gonna learn a lot myself as I go, but we'll have some fun. It's a holiday project. If it doesn't look perfect, who cares? It's the spirit of the whole thing that counts. So let's jump into the painting. Now I may be crazy, but what I'm gonna go for here is a multi-layered faux finish. I want each one of these to have its own base color, and then we'll put a color on top of that that will then sand through so we could expose the color beneath. And it gives it sort of a worn, classic, antique kind of look. And the effect that I'm going for is a snow-covered tree and then a snow-covered base. So the base color we're going to use here is going to be red. I've got General Finishes Brick Red Milk Paint. On the tree, I'm going to be using their basil color, and it's not quite the green I'm looking for, and I'm too lazy to go out and buy another can of the color that is the right color, so I'm just going to take this as my base coat, and then I'm going to add a little bit of dye to it to really brighten it up and make it a little bit more of an intense green that's a little more of the classic Christmas green and red. But maybe let's call it a little bit more of a contemporary version. It won't be so stark and bright. So that's what I'm hoping to do. Now, just a word about these General Finishes milk paints, because I know some of you are screaming at the screen right now. These are not really milk paint. It's one of those marketing labeling things, and what this really is just acrylic water-based paint. They call it milk paint because it has the look of milk paint, and I've said this before a lot in the past. You can buy an oil-based finish labeled as a tongue oil finish, and it doesn't contain any tongue oil. It just means that the finish it produces looks like a tongue oil finish. So it can be very confusing, but that being said, these are very, very high quality acrylic paints, and I think they're perfect for this project. But just know that really any paint that you can get access to, water-based paint, even oil-based paint would be fine for a project like this. But again, just a labeling thing. So let's get started with this. I'm gonna start with my base coats first, let those dry, and then we'll talk about what happens next to achieve this faux finish. So of course, we start by giving it a good mix. And I have a relatively inexpensive synthetic brush here. I think that'll be fine for our purposes. Boy, that's a nice color, huh? Now once the top is in place, the only thing that's really gonna be visible here is this little part of the stump. We're gonna put some decorative things in the front, so none of this will even be seen, but I'm still gonna be careful and use a smaller acid brush to get down into this area in here. But I'm not so concerned about, you know, touching that little mahogany post. It's not that big of a deal. Now I'm really not too worried about brush strokes at this point. Frankly, I think that's just going to add to the appeal and the sort of rustic look of this piece, so brush strokes are just not an issue for me right now. I've got one door right here that doesn't seem to want to close, and I don't know whether it's because the moisture in the paint has caused a little bit of swelling or not, but a few passes, very careful passes with the block plane should help me get it to fit again. That's better. Now I want to apply another coat to each one of these pieces to really, make sure we have a good layer of color there. But before we do, we need to sand this. If you feel it now, you got to remember, this is water-based paint, so just like any other water-based finish, when that hits the surface of the wood, it causes the grain fibers to swell and makes it really rough. So we need to knock that down. So I'm going to use a 220 grit piece of sandpaper, and I don't have to get too aggressive here. Just a nice light touch will smooth everything out. And after our sanding, we can apply coat number 2. And you really should have absolute complete coverage at this point. All right, our base coats are done, so what's next? Well, you could, if you wanted to, just apply your next color right on top. For me, I want to protect this color a little bit because if you sand through that top color, it's not too long before you're sanding into the base color and then right into the wood itself. So it's a good idea to protect this with a clear coat first. And this way, when you put your next color on top of that, we've got that extra layer of protection that as soon as we start to see that green color show through, we know we can stop. And if we do happen to sand just a little bit more, it's not really going to hurt anything. We have quite a bit of material there before we get into the green and then into the bare wood itself. So you got a couple options here. Basically, any water-based clear coat should do the trick. What I'm going to recommend is either something like General Finishes polyacrylic, satin, of course, we're going satin all the way through this thing. But if you want to make the job really quick, just go to the home store and pick up some Minwax, their version of the polyacrylic. Clear satin in the spray form like this is great. You can cover all of this in literally seconds. The General Finishes material is great, but you're going to have to brush it on or have an HVLP or something so you could spray it yourself. So for me today, I'm going with the Minwax. Now I gave the clear coat about 2 hours to dry and we're ready to apply our white paint, but the problem is there's a lot of different versions of white. Here alone in my collection, I have 3 different whites. I've got Snow White, Antique White, and one called Linen. Now the Antique White is probably where I'm going to go. It's middle of the road. Snow White, even though what I'm trying to simulate here is snow, Snow White is just too bright. It's a vivid, bright, pure white. I don't think it's right for this. I want more of an antique look. Linen would be okay as well, but linen has a little bit too much brown in it, a little bit darker and dirtier than I want it to look. So the Antique White I think is perfect. It has just enough brown in it to give it sort of an aged look. I think it's going to be just the right color for this. So let's start painting again. An hour later, I'm going for a second coat here. The sides and back, I might be able to just get away with the 2 coats, but on the front, because I'm going so light, trying to avoid getting big blobs of paint stuck in the doors, I may have to go to 3 coats on that, but obviously the process is the same for each coat. So after that final coat, I let the pieces dry overnight, and now it's time for the fun part, the sanding. Now, I don't know that there's really a right or a wrong way to do this. I mean, it really is whatever technique you want to use and whatever look you want to achieve. For me personally, my target goal here is I really want to show a lot of the red in the base. I don't want a huge amount of white on that. For the top piece, I'm probably going to leave a lot of the white for the most part and expose the green. So, how you tackle this is up to you. I really wouldn't recommend using any sort of a power sander on this at all because I think you can go too far too quickly. So all hand sanding, but let's jump right into it. I'm a novice at this too, so we'll see what happens. So I'm basically just going to start by taking long, smooth strokes like this and just kind of letting whatever happens happen. This will flatten out a lot of those brush strokes. It'll thin out the white paint and hopefully give us that sort of faded look that we're going for. Now take your time with this. Just see where it goes. So I've got a good amount of green showing through the white color here. And I think for now we'll leave that and go to the rest of the piece. I don't want to take any one area too far until I see how that kind of thing looks over the entire structure. So let's go ahead and just start on the other end and see what happens. Now on the front of the piece, I'm just going to kind of by hand go through, sand each door, expose a little bit of color, just Just kind of making it look like a worn surface. I think the important thing with stuff like this is not to think too hard about it. If you start to plan too strategically, you lose that sort of random feel that you expect to see in something that is naturally worn over time. But also, again, I say don't think about it too much, but you do want to also keep in mind, if you really are looking for something authentic, you want to keep in mind where the areas that would be worn the most. So areas around the door, or, from opening and closing year after year, those would be areas that would naturally have some extra wear and tear. But I think for this, it's just kind of random is really the way to go. Now with our front done, for the most part, I can get a much better perspective on how I want these sides to appear. So I can go back and revisit some of these spots, and if I want to make the green a little more noticeable, I could just sand more. Now that should do it for the sanding, and before I glue these two pieces together, I've got quite a bit of work to do on the front here, and it's much easier to do that if I could lay it flat on its back. So first off, of course, I have my little door handles that need to be installed, and before I do, I need to clean out some of that paint that's in there. So I just got my 1/4-inch Forstner bit that I used to make the hole, and by hand, I'm just going to very carefully try and use it to clean out that paint. There's really no way to avoid getting the paint in there during the painting process. I kind of just gave up on trying to be super clean. But doing this by hand actually works rather well. Now, of course, our doors need little numbers, so you know exactly which one to open on which day. So I've got this little baby stencil here, and I'm going to try my luck putting numbers on these doors. I found with this paint, less is more sort of thing. You put too much and it kind of makes a smudgy looking number. That's number 1. Cool. Now the last couple things that we need to do are to install our little door handles. And we cut these earlier, but these are really nothing more than dowel stock that's been dipped in a bunch of black dye. So kind of cool. And they'll just pop in like so with a little epoxy, and I've got my nice little door handle. Now in addition to that, I would like to add a little star to the top. I think this area up here is just kind of begging to have something there, so I just cut this little star out of some very thin stock here, and I'm just going to epoxy it to the top like so. Now a coat or two of polyacrylic should finish it off nicely. Now our protective finish is nice and dry, and we could finally do the last glue up here. So let me put a little bit of Tite Bond glue on the post. It's a pretty tight fit here, so it's not really going to need a whole lot. A little on the front, and a little on the back. And also, you'll notice, no one's really going to see the underside of this thing. So I was careful to avoid getting getting any paint in the center section where I knew we would be gluing something together later. And I'm just going to eyeball the center here. This door happens to be centered, so I use that as a frame of reference. Okay. Take a little pressure, make sure it's fully seated, and there you have it. I think a little bit of fake snow might finish this off nicely. So I found the perfect place for my advent calendar, right here on the ledge near the front door. Now I'm really happy with the way the project came out. Overall, it's pretty much how I envisioned it. It was a trickier project than I expected it to be, though. When I first started planning it out, I thought this was like, maybe a 2 or 3 day quick knockout project. But the small scale, the triangular shape here, a lot of those little details with the double-sided nails, things like that were a little bit trickier than I expected them to be. So hopefully I've ironed some of that out for you. And if you want to build this exact model, you'll have an easier time than I did. If you want to simplify things a little bit, I would recommend maybe taking away the triangular shape. Now I know that completely changes everything, but that's not such a bad thing. Maybe make a square or a rectangle. And instead of hinged doors, one of the great ideas that I heard submitted on the blog when I started talking about the doors was to possibly have little drawers that would pop in. And that would be a lot easier to assemble all these little tiny drawers and have them pull out. You could put something inside the drawer itself. So there's a lot of different ways that you could handle that to simplify things for yourself. The other thing I'll mention is the painting. Be very careful when you're sanding these multiple layers of color. When you sand into that base coat, for instance, I sand through the white and I expose this green. If I don't get all that green dust up and then you hit it with a water-based finish afterwards, it sort of reactivates the color and the color winds up spreading over the surface like a stain. And I did get a little bit of that on the top here, and it kind of looks a little bit like a grass stain. The thing is, it doesn't matter so much on a project like this because it's distressed, because symbolically this is a tree in like a flower pot. It's not really going to be that big of a deal if there's a little bit of a green hue to it. But if you're working on a project for a client, let's say, or the clients inside your home who want something painted and they want that sort of double layered distressed antique look, that may not work. You would probably have a do-over at that point. So I don't know about you guys, but this has gotten me into the holiday spirit. I've got to find some little treats and things to put inside here to get it all stocked up for December. But I'm really excited and I can't wait for the holidays. So thanks for watching, everybody. Take care.
Who am I kidding? I tried to be okay with the grass stained paint job, I really did, but I just couldn't live with it. So that very night I went back into the shop, scraped the white paint off, sanded it smooth, reapplied the green paint, re-stenciled my numbers, and ended up with this instead. Not what I originally planned, but ultimately a better product. And frankly, I think I like it better with the green face and the white roof. And best of all, no more grass stains.